It was a cold Tuesday morning in London, the kind of morning where the sky hangs low and gray and the air bites at your face no matter how many layers you wear. The city was already awake, as it always is, the early buses rolling through empty streets, the pigeons pecking at the wet pavement near Buckingham Palace, and the iron gates standing tall and silent as they always do. The changing of the guard was not scheduled for that day, so there were fewer tourists than usual, just a handful of early risers with cameras hanging around their necks, hoping to catch a glimpse of something royal. They did not know that what they were about to see would give them far more than they had hoped for. King Charles III had woken earlier than usual that morning. His schedule was full, as it always was, packed with meetings and briefings and official engagements that filled every hour of his day. But before all of that, he had chosen to do something simple. He wanted to walk. Not a formal walk, not a procession or a public appearance, but a quiet stroll through the grounds of the palace before the world got too loud. He had always found comfort in the early morning, in that brief window when things felt still and manageable, before the weight of the crown made itself fully known. He pulled on a dark coat and stepped out with just one protection officer walking at a respectful distance behind him. He came around a corner near one of the side entrances, a part of the palace grounds that most visitors never see, shielded from public view by old stone walls and tall hedges. This was where one of the palace guards was stationed, a young man who had been on duty since before dawn. The guard's name was Private Thomas Ellison, 22 years old, just 8 months into his posting at Buckingham Palace. He had grown up in a small town in Yorkshire, the son of a plumber and a school dinner lady, the kind of background that makes you both proud and terrified when you end up standing guard outside one of the most famous buildings in the world. He had trained hard, he had earned his place, and he took his duties very seriously, perhaps more seriously than some of the older guards, who had long grown comfortable with the rhythms of palace life. Private Ellison had been standing at his post for hours. His back was straight, his rifle was held correctly, and his eyes were focused ahead in that blank, disciplined way that palace guards are trained to achieve. And he had been told, as all guards are told, that no matter what happens, no matter who approaches, no matter what is said or done, he must not move, he must not speak, he must not react, he must stand like stone and let the world move around him. It is a test of discipline that most people find impossible to imagine actually doing. But these guards train for months to be able to carry it out. They stand through rain and heat and wind. They stand while tourists shout at them and children pull faces and photographers flash their cameras. They stand, always, completely still. So when King Charles appeared around the corner and began walking toward him, Private Ellison did what he had been trained to do. He stood still. His eyes did not move. His expression did not change. He showed no sign that he had even registered the presence of the man walking toward him, the man who happened to be the King of England. King Charles stopped a few feet away from him. This was already unusual. The king did not typically pause at individual guard posts during his morning walks. His protection officer slowed as well, watching. The few tourists near the outer wall, who had been wandering toward the gates, noticed the king and began quietly gathering closer, pulling out their phones. Nobody wanted to make noise and disturb the moment, but everyone was watching. The king looked at the guard. The guard stared straight ahead. There was a moment, just a brief one, where the king seemed to consider something. Then he did what very few people, even senior members of the royal household, would have thought to do. He gave a small and deliberate nod, not a wave, not a greeting, just a nod, the kind that carries meaning between two people who understand respect and duty. It was the kind of gesture that acknowledges another person not as a decoration or a piece of protocol, but as a human being doing a hard job. Private Ellison did not move. This was exactly what he was supposed to do. Every guard knows this. You do not respond. You do not nod back. You do not acknowledge even the king himself during active duty. The rules are the rules, and they apply to everyone without exception. Private Ellison's training had been clear and absolute on this point, and he had internalized it completely. But then something happened that nobody expected. Private Ellison's right eye twitched, just slightly, just barely. It was not quite a blink and not quite a wink, but something in between, a tiny involuntary movement, the kind the human face makes sometimes when the brain is working very hard to suppress every natural instinct, because every natural instinct Private Ellison had was screaming at him in that moment. The king was right there. The king had nodded at him. Everything in his upbringing, everything in his sense of manners and decency and respect was pushing against the training that told him to stay still. And that battle, happening entirely inside his body, had leaked out in the smallest possible way, through that one tiny twitch. King Charles saw it. And that was the moment the king froze, not in anger, not in confusion, but in something more complicated and more human than either of those things. He froze in the way a person freezes when they suddenly understand something they had not fully understood before. He had walked past hundreds of guards in his life. He had stood beside them at ceremonies. He had read about their training. He had signed off on the protocols that govern their conduct. But standing here, this close, watching this young man fight with every muscle in his face to do his duty correctly, the reality of it landed differently. There was a person in there, a real person, with real instincts and real feelings, choosing every single second to override all of them out of duty. And the tiniest crack in that discipline, that one tiny twitch, had made the whole thing suddenly and unexpectedly moving. The protection officer noticed the king had stopped and waited quietly. For the tourists at the outer wall had their phones out but were not speaking. Even the pigeons seemed to have gone quiet. King Charles stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably no more than 30 seconds. Then he did something that surprised everyone watching, including, it would later become clear, himself. He straightened up slightly, pulled his shoulders back, and gave a second nod. A slower one this time. More deliberate. Not the nod of a king acknowledging a servant, but the nod of one person recognizing another. Then he turned and continued his walk, his hands clasped behind his back, moving at the same quiet pace he had been before. Private Ellison remained at his post. He did not move. He did not react. But the red around the rims of his ears, which one of the tourists later mentioned in an online post, had told a different story entirely. The story might have ended there, a small moment witnessed by a handful of people on a quiet morning, forgotten by the afternoon. But it did not end there, because one of the tourists had been filming. Not in an intrusive way, just a quiet video taken from a distance, the kind of thing people do now almost without thinking. And when she posted it later that day with a short caption explaining what she thought she had seen, it began to spread. Slowly at first, then faster, then very fast indeed. People were drawn to it for reasons that were hard to fully explain. The video itself was not dramatic. You could see the king walking, stopping, nodding. You could see the guard standing perfectly still. You could not really see the eye twitch. It was too small and too brief from that distance. Now, but people who watched it described feeling something anyway, a kind of quiet tension in the scene, a sense that something meaningful was happening between two people, even though neither of them appeared to be doing anything at all. The comments filled up quickly. Some people talked about the discipline it takes to stand that still for that long. Some people talked about what it means to serve, to put duty above every personal feeling. Some people talked about the king, and what it said about him that he had stopped at all, that he had noticed, that he had nodded twice. A retired sergeant major from the household division left a long comment that was shared thousands of times, explaining in detail what that guard was going through inside his head and body in that moment, what it costs a person to maintain that level of control over a long shift. But many of the most shared comments were simpler than that. They were from ordinary people, many of them far from Britain, who said that the video had made them feel something unexpected. One woman wrote that she had watched it 4 times and cried each time, though she could not explain exactly why. A man who described himself as someone who had never cared about the royal family wrote that the video had changed something small but real in how he thought about the people who dedicate their lives to institutions larger than themselves. A teacher in Canada used it in a lesson about duty and restraint and what it means to be professional under pressure. None of these people had met Private Ellison. Most of them would never know his name, but they had seen something in him, in the line of his back and the set of his jaw and that one tiny twitch that felt true and recognizable and worth paying attention to. At the palace, the incident was noted. These things are always noted. It was not treated as a breach because technically it was not one. Private Ellison had maintained his post. He had not spoken or moved or deviated from his duties in any meaningful way. The eye twitch was biological, not behavioral. His commanding officer, when the video surfaced, reviewed the footage and then called the young man in for a brief conversation. It was described afterward by those who were told about it as a warm one. The officer reportedly said something along the lines of, "You did your job perfectly," and then he looked at the young man for a moment and added, "Yeah, and you did something else as well, which I think took even more out of you." Private Ellison reportedly said nothing in response. He just nodded, which some people later found quietly funny given everything that had happened. The king was briefed on the video. Those close to him said he watched it once, smiled once, and did not comment beyond that. But a few days later, during a formal inspection of the household division, something was noticed by several people present. When King Charles reached one particular young guardsman in the lineup, he paused a half-second longer than he did at the others. He did not say anything. He did not break protocol. But he looked at the young man directly, and then he gave a slow, deliberate nod, the kind that carries weight, the kind that says, "I see you." Whether or not that guardsman was Thomas Ellison, nobody who was present has confirmed publicly, but the story spread anyway, because it felt right, and sometimes that is enough. What the whole episode pointed to, underneath all the video shares and the comments and the warm feelings, was something older and more complicated than a nice moment between a king and a guard. It pointed to the strange, almost invisible web of duty that holds certain kinds of institutions together. The guards at Buckingham Palace are not simply decorative. They are not there to be photographed, though they are photographed constantly. They are there because somewhere in the long history of these buildings and these roles, someone decided that presence matters, that a human being standing at attention communicates something that a camera or a locked door does not. And the cost of that communication is paid in hours of stillness, in muscles held rigid, in instinct suppressed, in the daily, unglamorous work of being exactly where you are supposed to be and doing exactly what you are supposed to do, whether anyone is watching or not. Private Thomas Ellison had been doing that work since before the sun rose that morning. He had been doing it alone, mostly unobserved, in the cold. And then the king had walked around a corner, and for 30 seconds the whole weight of what that work actually means had pressed itself into the space between two people standing a few feet apart on a quiet morning in London. The king had frozen because he had felt that weight too. And that, in the end, was the whole story. Not a crisis, not a scandal, not even really a dramatic event by most definitions, but just a moment when something true became briefly visible, and a few dozen tourists and millions of people who watched a video afterward caught a glimpse of it before it disappeared back into the ordinary flow of the day. The gates opened, as they always do. The tourists wandered off. The protection officer fell back into step. The pigeons returned to the pavement. Private Ellison remained at his post. He would be there until his relief came, and then he would go inside, eat something warm, and sleep before doing it all again. Because that is the job. And he had chosen it, and he was good at it. And on a cold Tuesday morning in London, a king had noticed.